Is Warren still on?
I think he said he muted himself.
Ah, okay. Well, it's a little bit after 10, so I think you can probably get started whenever you're ready.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Glad that you were able to join us this morning. As usual, you can send in questions in the chat box, and we'll try to address any questions that you have. And Jen and Warren, if y'all will help me keep track of those, if there's something I need to stop and answer during the presentation, let me know that, and I will take care of it. What I'm going to do this morning is basically cover the basics of adaptive high stock density grazing, and to try to help you understand the principles that we're outlining for this particular grazing methodology, and to help you understand how we effectively put it into practice. So we're going to go ahead and dive in this morning. Okay, I can get the slides to Okay, there we go. Okay, one of the things that we have found is that we have implemented adaptive high stock density grazing practices in many different areas of the country, and including different areas of North America, Mexico, and South America. And we have had very successful results in all different types of climates, regions, topographies, elevations, and so forth. So it's not a grazing method that is restricted to just a very, very temperate type environment. It also works very well in higher elevation environments and in more arid environments. Basically, adaptive high stock density grazing allows us to do a number of very beneficial things. It allows us to build soil organic matter and soil microbial populations. We're able to significantly improve plant species diversity through tapping into the latent seed bank that exists in the soil. We have found that we're able to enhance soil water infiltration and retention, to increase livestock carrying capacity, to reduce our reliance on fertilizers, herbicides, and other inputs, and to improve overall soil health, plant health, animal health, and performance. Jeff Goodwin, a Texas GLCI grazing land specialist, had this quote. He said, "Adaptive grazing uses the animal to improve manure distribution, reduce plant selectivity, increase plant diversity, and improve soil function." Now, this is what we're after. We're after stand density and diversity rather than concentrating on monocultures. And I must admit, I spent a large part of my academic career doing just that. But what I have found is that for significant improvement in soil health and improvement in animal performance and many of these other parameters that we're talking about, really what we need in our pastures is stand density and diversity. When we have monocultures, basically these are some of the things that we see occurring. We see selective grazing that often results in overgrazing certain areas, particularly related to in pastures where the soil fertility profile may be a little better, and that monoculture may be a little more nutrient dense or mineral dense than it is in other areas. So we see some nutrient mining. We see greater weed pressure, limited grazing season, and variable forage quality is often associated with monocultures. And typically with many of the improved forage varieties that are out there, a lot of the hybrids and so forth, the fact is we have to have a greater reliance on fertilizers and then during the periods when they're not in high productivity, greater reliance on hay and other supplements for our livestock. Oftentimes, when we compare monocultures to polycultures, we have lower overall forage dry matter production with the monocultures unless we're applying very high inputs in terms of water and fertilizer and that type of thing. They typically have lower tolerance to drought, heat, and cold issues. We see greater parasite problems, and obviously this is more related to issues of the poor grazing practices on a lot of our monocultures, and we see little soil building impact. When we have greater plant diversity in our pastures, then that supports greater root depth and mass. This would include both a mix of fibrous and taproot type plants. We often record greater forage dry matter production. We have data that clearly shows that, that greater plant diversity coupled with the proper livestock impact builds soil organic matter and microbial populations. We find that those pastures, the diverse pastures, are more tolerant of environmental stressors. We have extended grazing seasons, and therefore our cattle can better balance their diets with less reliance on supplements. And as a side benefit, we get an enhancement in wildlife, pollinator, insect, and earthworm populations. If we take a look at this particular diagram here, you see a multi-paddock grazing system that has been laid out for a farm or a ranch. Now, this is a real-life multi-paddock grazing situation that was implemented on a ranch in Texas, the Edwards Ranch. And what was happening is that researchers there, Richard Teague and his co-workers there, fitted cattle on this ranch with GPS collars and monitored their grazing behavior and their patterns, where they spent all their time. The ranch, prior to implementing the multi-paddock planned grazing system, basically had a more conventional or set stock grazing system where the cattle were allowed to more freely roam the ranch. They had a very, very loose rotational system. But you can see from this diagram, all of the fluorescent green points are the cattle concentration points. So bottom line is that in a year's time, the cattle only utilized 39% of the available area on the ranch, and 41% of all the GPS points were concentrated on only 9% of the total land area of that ranch. So if we overlay that diagram, the GPS diagram, with that grazing, multi-paddock grazing plan that we showed in the first slide there, you can see now we have the ability on the Edwards Ranch to be able to control the movement of the cattle across that ranch. They'll graze more total landscape across the acreage of the ranch. They'll select a wider variety of plant species, and the owner can control how much is grazed, the period of grazing, and the length and time of recovery. Obviously, this is another ranch where you just see a typical multi-paddock grazing system that was designed and set up that not only shows the division of the paddocks, but also location of water for ideal movement of the livestock through the farm. And obviously, not all of these paddock divisions have to be permanent. Many of these can be temporary using electrified polywire. This is work that was done by the University of Nebraska and the USDA, and they found that when you grazed properly, and we're going to talk a lot more about this in a little bit, but when you did not have heavy defoliation in a pasture before you moved the livestock on, then they were able to maintain year-round 95% ground cover in those pastures. And you can see that runoff was limited to 20% or less with no soil loss. Where we had heavier grazing pressure in terms of allowing them to defoliate those forages in the pastures to a heavier degree, and we maintained only 75% ground cover on an annual basis, you'll see that water runoff jumped up all the way up to 60%, and now we're starting to see significant soil loss in terms of tons per acre, approaching a ton per acre annually. When we overgraze, overstock, and we're maintaining only 50% ground cover, then you can see that runoff was 80% or greater, and soil loss was more than 5 tons per acre annually. This is an example from the Noble Foundation of what they were able to accomplish, again using multi-paddock grazing, where they were using adaptive high stock density type principles. And you can see that in a decade's time, they increased animal unit days by almost 300% during that time period. Now, this is what we typically see happening when we allow our livestock to take more than 50% of the available forage dry matter in any one grazing period in any one paddock or pasture. You can see that if we go up to 50%, we have either no root growth stoppage or no more than 2 to 4% root growth stoppage. However, it changes very quickly when we get to 60% and greater removal of available forage dry matter in any one paddock or pasture. You can see that it jumps from 2 to 4% at 50% all the way up to 50% root growth stoppage when we have 60% leaf volume removed. And obviously that means that it takes significantly longer for those pastures to recover, and if you're under dry conditions, some of those forages are not going to recover. Now, Dr. Teague, in his studies on looking at adaptive grazing, found this list of benefits to the ecosystem when we implement these types of grazing strategies. And this is quite an impressive list, as you can see. I won't go through all of this, but obviously you'll have this slide presentation available to you. But these are all documented benefits from the research that they've done. Now let's dive in a little bit to adaptive high stock density grazing itself. In this particular picture, this is actually on Doug Peterson's farm in Missouri, and Doug has been implementing adaptive high stock grazing principles for a number of years now, but the density that you're seeing here is approximately 200,000 pounds per acre. This is implementing adaptive high stock grazing in the Flint Hills of Kansas. And in this particular slide, this is the stocking density in this paddock of 150,000 pounds per acre, and this is on native tallgrass prairie. This would be up in North Dakota, and this is a stocking density of 500,000 pounds per acre, and then this is a stocking density of 1,000,000 pounds per acre. Now obviously, as you increase stocking density, then by necessity you also have to significantly increase the frequency of the moves. When you go to ultra high stock density levels, you're now talking about multiple moves a day. Now, this is often when people hear about high stock density, and a lot of times people will term this mob grazing or whatever. This is where things start to fall apart for them. They wonder, how in the world can I do this, and why would I do this? I don't have time or the resources to do this. Well, the fact of the matter is, when you go at these types of stock densities, say 250,000 pounds or greater per acre in terms of your total density, this is not something that you either want to do year-round or have to do year-round. This is something that you can do for a very short period of time during a grazing season and have significant soil building and plant diversity impacts that will lead you into next year's grazing season on that same piece of ground. So what I often tell my clients that implement this is pick the acreage on your farm or ranch that you most want to improve in that given year and take 3, 4, 5 or more days out of the year. Everybody can do that. And implement an ultra high stock density practice on just that acreage. In other words, you're not doing this on your whole farm or ranch every year unless you want to. You know, you're picking your poorest ground, your worst producing ground, and you're implementing this specifically for rapid soil building and development of plant diversity. And in this situation, you would move the cattle 5 to 10 times a day. It's very simple to do. You can pre-build the paddocks. Then all you're doing during that day is just simply opening a gap gate, single strand or bungee strap gap gate, any type of gap gate you want, and allowing them to flow directly into the next paddock. Obviously, you need to be there and observe their grazing so that they don't overgraze the paddocks that you have on. You need to pre-calculate the available forage dry matter so that you know that you're giving them enough for that entire 24-hour period as you rotate them through the paddocks. And you can even take up the strands between the paddocks that day as you want them to flow from one to the other, because at these stock densities, they're not going to back graze. They're only going to graze forward because they will have essentially fouled the ground that they previously grazed due to their trampling, their manure and urine applications. So that greatly discourages them from back grazing at all during that time period. They're just not going to do it. So it's very easy to make them flow forward and to achieve what you want them to achieve during that short time period. After that concentrated period of just a few days annually, then you can go back and relax this grazing and go back to lower stock densities. However, I would recommend that they still maintain an average move frequency of every 1 to 3 days. Now again, this is some work by Teague and his co-workers, and you can see that in a typical grazing practice where you have a light continuous graze in the upper left-hand corner, upper right-hand corner of this picture, then you see where the cattle have been extremely selective in their grazing, and they have overgrazed certain spots within this pasture and severely undergrazed other spots. However, when you apply high stock density grazing, you can see that you have a very high degree of uniformity in the pasture, both in terms of plant diversity and stand density. Okay, it's very easy to move cattle once you implement this type of system. On the picture on the left-hand side, this is the cattle, again, in a high stock density paddock, just ahead of movement to the next paddock. The picture on the right-hand side of the slide shows the cattle moving into the new paddock, and right in the middle of that slide, you can clearly see the divisor between the grazed section and the ungrazed section. And we just simply took up the strand. The cattle flowed directly into the ungrazed section, and the degree of forage left in the grazed section and the degree of trample is what we're aiming for. We definitely want to leave ground cover there. We don't want to leave bare ground, and we want to leave enough leaf material so that we get active photosynthetic activity and forage regrowth after that grazing period. This is on our farm here in Mississippi, and this illustrates how easy it is to move cattle when they're trained to this type of grazing system. What we were doing in this series of slides is I had this particular farm is about, from east to west, goes a little over 2 miles. I'd had them on the east end, rotating through paddocks there, and then I wanted to move them all the way over to the west end and start back there and then work my way back towards the middle. And so to move the cattle 2 miles from the east end to the west end, all I did was hopped in my Ranger. The cattle know the sound of the Ranger. I went over to the east end, called them, and they just lined up and followed me 2 miles. And even though they were walking across portions of those 2 miles, they were walking across paddocks that had not been grazed. So there was excellent forage in those paddocks. The cattle never put their heads down and stopped and grazed. They in their mind, they were thinking, well, he has something even better for us. This is how disciplined they get in this. And they followed me all the way across for 2 miles until I stopped, and that's when they stopped. And you can see that in the bottom left-hand slide. That's where I have my gap gate, and you can see the cattle starting to congregate there. And in the bottom right-hand slide, I open the gap gate, and the cattle are moving into the new paddock. Okay, basically, and this is what, taken directly off the NRCS website, so all of y'all have seen this, but obviously we know that clean air and water start with being able to improve soil quality and soil organic matter, and we know the benefits that we derive from that. There is a value to being able to build soil organic matter, and this value is directly correlated to building nutrients in the soil, that as we build these nutrients, it allows us to reduce reliance on fertilizer. So we have a number of different nutrients listed here that are vital to growth of our plants, and we see that for every 1% soil organic matter, we have about $750 per acre in nutrients available. So as we build that soil organic matter, if we go up to 5% soil organic matter, we now have over $3,700 per acre worth of soil nutrients available to our plants. Now, another thing that building soil organic matter does for us is it allows us to control rainwater runoff. Soil that is 2% organic matter will typically hold about 32,000 gallons of water, or 21% of a rainfall. At 5% organic matter, our soils can now hold about 53% of a rainfall, and at 8% of organic matter, they can now hold 85% of a rainfall. That is a significant increase in water retention, as we all can see, and obviously would significantly reduce soil loss, all the sediment loss, the nitrate and phosphate leaching, and those types of issues that we face. This slide shows that no matter the soil type, and since I consult all over the country and do a lot of work everywhere from Florida up into Canada and the Pacific Northwest and those types of areas, I often have ranchers and farmers that say, yeah, but my soil's different. I can't build soil organic matter, or we're in Florida, we're sandy, we can't do anything about that. But this slide clearly shows that it doesn't matter the type of soil that you're in. If you build organic matter, you're going to build water holding capacity. All of you have seen this. Many of you have done these demonstrations at field days and pasture walks and so forth. And you know that this is a very influential way to convince farmers and ranchers that they need to implement better practices for soil and water conservation. You can see that in panel from left to right, panels 1, 3, and 4, we have little to no ground cover with the simulated 1-inch rainfall. We have high water runoff and a lot of topsoil loss. However, where we have adequate cover, whether it's from a cocktail cover crop mix, as in panel number 2, or what I would call properly grazed pasture before we move the livestock on, in panel number 5, we have very little water loss or runoff and very little topsoil loss. So the bottom line is this: for every 1% increase in organic matter in our soils, they can hold approximately 25,000 gallons more water per acre. This is data taken from University of Wisconsin Extension, and basically what they were doing was they were looking at different types of farming and grazing practices and their impact on soil loss. You can see that in Wisconsin, the typical row cropping practice averages almost 3 tons per acre annually of soil loss, topsoil loss. In the typical dairy cropping system in Wisconsin, they average almost a ton. But when we implement adaptive grazing principles, you can see that we pretty much mitigate topsoil loss. Now, 90% of soil function is mediated by microbes in the soil, but those microbes depend on the plants that are growing in that soil. And so without proper plant management above the soil, we're going to have poor microbial functioning below the soil. So Dr. Christine Jones and her work has found that plant growth and health are highly correlated with the microbial life in the soil. And not just pure microbial life, but the community structure of that microbial population is important. And two of the most important factors are the fungi to bacteria ratio in our soils and the microbial predator to prey ratios in those soils. Now, this series of slides just simply shows what we can look for on the soil surface and above the soil that will be a strong indicator of a high level of microbial activity beneath that soil surface without having to do actual soil microbial profiles. If we pull back the sward in our pastures, our forage sward, and if we see lots of insects, arthropods scurrying out of the sunlight, okay, on the soil surface, and we see earthworm castings and earthworm castles and those types of things, evidence of earthworm activity, soil level arthropods and high populations of earthworms come with building soil microbial populations. So if we take a spade and we dig down 6 to 8 inches beneath that soil surface, this is what we should come up with. Even in the middle of pastures, not just on the shaded edges, not just by lifting up a log or a rock or something like that, but we should see earthworms throughout our pastures when they're properly managed. We should also see dung beetles returning to our pastures. Now, obviously, the return of dung beetles also means that we have to take a look at better management of our deworming practices, because a lot of dewormers or anthomenics can kill dung beetles. But when we have tremendous earthworm activity and dung beetle activity, we get a lot of benefits in terms of soil building. So we're after diversity then in our pastures. I'm going to go through very quickly some case studies here of some folks that have been able to implement these practices and to track results. Gabe Brown, many of you know Gabe or have heard of Gabe, and of course Gabe does quite a bit of speaking now, and there's a lot of features in you know, a lot of ag publications and so forth now talking about what Gabe has been able to do and the data that they've collected there. In 1991, he purchased land in North Dakota near Bismarck that had been heavily tilled for decades. And because of that, the use of synthetic fertilizers and herbicides was quite heavy. At the time that he purchased this ground, his soil organic matter was only 1.7 to 1.9% with water infiltration rates of only a ½ inch per hour. By contrast, native rangeland that had not been tilled in his area had 7% organic matter and 6 inches per hour water infiltration rates. Now Gabe, through the years, he went through some hard times in the early to mid-90s, and 3 times almost lost the ranch. He had 3 crop failures in succession. And basically his lender said no more, no more operational loans. And so Gabe had to find something to help him save the farm, save the ranch. And so one of the things that he turned to is he started experimenting with what he now calls biological primers, and that is diverse cover crop mixes. And by using diverse cover crop mixes where he was growing row crops and implementing adaptive high stock grazing principles, but also implementing those same principles on his native rangeland on that same farm, he has now been able to increase his soil organic matter to over 6% in many of the fields. His water infiltration rates now exceed 8 inches per hour, and he's been able to significantly reduce his chemical use, whether it's inorganic fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, all of those types of things. So obviously that's quite a bit of savings in inputs. When the USDA NRCS out of Mandan took a look at microbial activity in a lot of Gabe's fields and compared them to fields that had not been grazed using these methodologies, they found some astounding results. They found that in fields with high microbial activity, forage dry matter exceeded 8,500 pounds per acre. Where there was low microbial activity, it was only 2,500 pounds per acre. We also had a resultant increase in forage quality, both in crude protein and TDN and other attributes. This is an example of some of Gabe's warm season cocktails that they plant. They do a row crop livestock rotation across a good portion of their farm. And so in the livestock grazing rotation, they'll utilize a lot of very diverse, very complex cocktails. This is the warm season. This will be a cool season cocktail mix that they would use quite frequently. You see the cattle out in some of these mixes here. This would be moving the cattle after a graze into the next paddock. And this is the type of trample that we're shooting for. You see that there's no exposed bare ground here. The cattle were not allowed to graze it down to that level, but the stock density was such that it produced a lot of trample, which will create a lot of ground litter and shelter that ground, protect ground moisture and new growth coming up. And this is an example of what we see when we have shaded ground covered with forage material, plant material, on the same day in the middle of the summer. Where we had shaded ground, the soil temperature was only 87 degrees. Where we had bare ground, it was 107 degrees. Now, why is this important? Well, at a soil temperature of 70 degrees, 100% of that soil moisture can be used for plant growth and regrowth. If your soil temperature reaches 100 degrees, 85% of your soil moisture is now lost, and only 15% is available for plant growth and regrowth. At 115 degrees, our microbes begin cellular breakdown, and at 140 degrees, they'll die. Now again, if we look at some work done by Teague and co-workers in Texas and the Southwest, comparing different grazing systems, you'll see that in terms of percent exposed bare ground, where we have heavy continuous grazing, you would have 30% or greater exposed bare ground in those pastures. Where we have what Teague calls heavy multi-camp grazing, which is basically adaptive high stock density grazing, you can see that we have very, very little bare ground. But even with light continuous grazing, where most people would think, well, we're not going to have, if it's light and continuous, we're not going to have exposed ground here. But you can see that we have more than twice the amount of exposed ground versus the adaptive high stock density type grazing. Now this is up in the upper Midwest, and this is an example of what you can do even in the winter time in terms of being able to graze cattle through when you have diverse, complex plant species growing. And this is obviously cover crops that were planted for summer grazing and then stockpiled for winter grazing. The values in TDN and crude protein that you see there were not the values for the summertime grazing. Those are the TDN and crude protein values as that forage is standing right there in that picture. So that's the nutrient value that those cattle are consuming in the dead of winter here. The same thing with the hairy vetch that they're grazing. The hairy vetch, even in the dead of winter with the snow cover, was still 18% crude protein, 70% TDN. The graze of radishes, again, very high nutritive value. Okay. The second case study was done at Aislinn Farms in Mississippi. And basically, I'm gonna go to this slide and show you this land was acquired approximately 5 years ago in the fall of the year, and this is what it looked like when it was acquired. It had been seriously mismanaged, very seriously mismanaged, and it had very little ground cover in many areas, and where it had ground cover, it was brush, weeds, brambles, and so forth. So what we did was we went in, and that first winter, since there was very little ground cover and little for the cattle to eat, we still introduced cattle, but we went in and we strategically placed bales in a checkerboard fashion and restricted cattle access on a daily basis to the bales using single-strand polywire and did a bale grazing. And then during the first growing season, we implemented a high stock density, short duration grazing with long rest periods after grazing each paddock, with the intent of tapping into the latent seed bank. And we also had some strategic use of some soil microbials. This is the first grazing season. Okay, you can see that there's a high prevalence of weeds and brush in these pastures, everything from ragweed, giant ragweed, pigweed, ironweed, ash, you name it. It was all here. We did not graze dry cows. We grazed lactating cows that had calved that spring. So these were heavy lactating, wet cows nursing calves. So we ran cow-calf pairs through this. And again, they were run at high stock densities and basically forced to learn to graze whatever was growing there. And they did. And this is the result. You can see that on the ragweed and ironweed and so forth, a lot of these grow 6 feet tall or taller, have rather thick stalks or stems. They will go in and strip all the leaves and eat all the leaves and leave the stalks and stems either trampled down or standing. And yet the cattle performed very well and actually not only maintained good body condition, but actually gained body condition during the summer grazing this. And so I went in and started monitoring the BRIX content. We're going to talk about BRIX and what it is here in just a little bit. We found that because a lot of these weeds were so deeply rooted that they were tapping into very rich nutrient or mineral sources beneath the soil surface and pulling those minerals up into the leaf material, and we had high BRIX content in a lot of these weeds. So the weeds actually turned into higher nutritive value than whatever few forages were growing underneath those weeds at that point in time. And when I observed grazing behavior with each paddock turn-in, the cattle, and I've even shot videos of this, but the cattle would selectively graze the weeds first, starting from the top and working their way down, and they would not graze the fescue and Bermuda grass and Dallas grass and other things that were starting to grow up underneath. They wouldn't graze that until they stripped all the leaves off the ironweed and ragweed. This is the second year. And you can see that just in simply one season of grazing, by the second season of grazing, using these principles, we have a dramatic difference in these same pastures. Now we have a lot higher percentage of actual what we would term true forages, and we have a lot of stand diversity. And these, nothing was planted here. So all of this came up from the first year to the second year through the late tapping into the latent seed bank and allowing long rest periods between coming back to these paddocks. This is what it looked like by the third year and by the fourth year. We're now entering our fifth grazing season on this piece of ground this year. So this is the progress to date. In 4 grazing seasons, the stocking rate has been tripled. The documented forage species has increased from less than 3 to 4 major species to now more than 3 dozen. The soil organic matter increased from 1.4 to 4.2%. BRIX increased more than 400%. We've seen significant increases in water infiltration and retention rates, and I will have to say almost astounding increases in wildlife, earthworm population, pollinator insects, and all of those types of things. Now, we saw what can happen in the upper Midwest. We saw what can happen in a much more temperate environment. Now let's look at a very arid environment. In implementing these same principles, what happens there in a desert type environment? With the Las Almas Ranch, located in north central Mexico in the Sierra Madre range, they have a typical average rainfall of 11 inches. But over the last 4 years, where they've been implementing adaptive grazing principles, their rainfall has been 10, 9, 8, and 5. 5 years ago, when they first started these principles, their entire ranch was basically a monoculture of tabasa grass. Now, there's over 2 dozen different forage species documented on that ranch. Many favorable species, such as side oats, grama, blue grama, green spangletop, and so forth, have now come in. When they first started this 5 years ago, they could only run 1 cow-calf unit per 200 acres. Now, the Las Almas Ranch can run 1 cow-calf unit per 40 acres. Their neighbors' ranches still are at the 1 to 200 ratio. This is a picture of the Las Almas Ranch contrasted to one of their neighbors' ranches. 5 years ago, there was no difference in terms of the way these ranches looked on either side of the fence. So you can see the significant difference now. And remember, this is with less than 10 inches of rainfall a year. And again, you can see what's happening on the Las Almas Ranch. Another benefit that we see when we have more frequent rotations is obviously much better manure distribution across all of our acreage. You know, when we have less frequent rotations, the manure and urine tends to be concentrated near shade and water sources or feed sources. So as we increase frequency of rotation of the cattle, movement of the cattle, then we increase our ability to be able to basically stockpile 1 pile of manure per every square yard of pasture. Now this is some data that was compiled by Doug Peterson in Missouri, looking at the impact of high stock density and plant diversity on being able to build soil organic matter. You can see in the time periods listed there, very significant increases in soil organic matter. And all of these fields were row cropped until the early 1990s before they were put back into grazing. This is some data that we have collected from clients in multiple regions of the U.S. And you can see that I have the time period listed there, the starting point in soil organic matter, and then the ending point as we had it at that particular time period. So again, no matter where we implemented these practices, we saw a significant increase in soil organic matter over a fairly short period of time. And this is just an example of some of the results that we typically see. In implementing these practices, and this was over a 4-year period here, we found that we had 50 to 60% more total plant root mass in the top 23 inches compared to where we did not implement these practices. So here's the strategies that we utilize for land improvement. We want to build soil organic matter and soil microbial populations through 2 primary tools: plant species diversity and livestock impact. And again, you've seen this slide before. That's our goal: increase diversity. And here's one of the primary reasons why. With a monoculture, as represented on the far left side of this diagram, you see that our root depth can only penetrate so far, and that root depth, by virtue of the fact that it's a monoculture, is going to be fairly homogeneous. It's going to be the same across all our pastures. But when we're able to incorporate plant species diversity, all of a sudden we increase diversity and complexity not only above ground but below ground. And so we see a mixture of root types: fibrous, mats, taproots, all of these different types of roots expanding out and down, and that's what we're after. So we want the livestock to do the work for us. We don't want to have to do the work for them. We need constant observation of our cattle, our forages, and our soils, what's happening with those. And, where do the majority of soil microbes live and function? Well, they live and function in the root zone, in that rhizosphere, okay? And so if we have a monoculture, then the microbes have very little living area, and they have limited food and water resources. But if we have polycultures, then all of a sudden we have significantly expanded the living area and the food and water resource area for our soil microbial population. I mentioned plant BRIX earlier, and this is something that's very important to us, and we have found that when we implement these practices and build plant species diversity and complexity and build soil organic matter, we also significantly increase BRIX. BRIX is a measure of dissolved plant solids that includes sugars, minerals, amino acids, proteins, lipids, and pectins in a plant. In other words, the nutrients of a plant. About 50 to 80% of a BRIX measurement of a plant is going to represent plant sugars, with the remaining portion representing the other nutrients. It's measured using a very simple instrument called a refractometer. Refractometers have been used for decades in the field in the agronomic area for fruit and vegetables. And this is why it's important to us, though, in grazing. We can have the exact same forages in a field, but we can have significant differences in the nutritive content or BRIX content of those forages, depending upon the soil organic matter and soil microbial activity in those fields. You can see that with several common forages listed here, whether it's alfalfa, fescue, Bermuda ryegrass, or whatever, we can range anywhere from poor BRIX content up to good to excellent BRIX content. And we'll show you some slides here in a little bit that are going to tell you how very important that is to animal performance. Now, when we're grazing cattle, and particularly, I think all of you know that I'm heavily involved in grass finishing cattle and in the grass finishing industry. And if we want a high degree of finish on those cattle, if we want choice, upper 2/3 choice and prime grass-fed cattle, then we have to have a nutrient energy level that is comparable to a feedlot ration. But it's got to be in our forages. And this slide helps us to understand, if we're going to grass finish cattle, where is our sweet spot for knowing where we have the optimum ratio between plant sugars and proteins to finish our cattle to the highest degree of finish and yet also have an excellent flavor profile. So you'll look and you'll see that early maturity forages are low in sugars but very high in protein. that is a very poor finishing ration. To our eye, we think it looks lush and wonderful, in that should finish cattle. Gains should be excellent, and they should deposit a lot of marbling, a lot of back fat. But actually, it harms our cattle. Grazing very early maturity, highly vegetative forages are not the optimum finishing pastures. You'll also produce an off flavor in that carcass due to the high protein level. However, if you get over to mid-maturity and beyond, you find that's where our sweet spot is for finishing cattle. Okay? You'll see that that's where we have the most optimum balance between plant sugars and proteins. And therefore, if you're finishing cattle on forages and trying to put that final finish on them between 900 and 1,200 pounds or so, this is where you need to turn them into the paddocks in terms of forage maturity, stage of maturity. Okay, now why is high BRIX important in our forages? Well, there's a number of peer-reviewed research articles that have shown that high BRIX forages increase animal gains, and in dairy cattle they increase milk production. But equally as important, researchers have also found that high BRIX forages also are more drought resistant, freeze tolerant, and more resistant to plant disease and pest. Now, this is data that we've collected in a lot of our studies looking at forage BRIX and different types of forage species across different regions of the country. The control would be conventional grazing and conventional fertilization if they're doing fertilization in these areas. And then the treatments are different intensities of grazing or stocking densities, excuse me. And you can see that these are single season results, okay, single grazing season results. You can see that by implementing high stock density grazing principles in all of these different regions of the country and different types of forages, we were able to significantly increase the forage BRIX. Same thing with forage dry matter over the controls. Okay, so the benefits of the high BRIX: more nutrient value, better dry matter, less water. The forages and crops actually taste sweeter to the livestock and have an enhanced aroma. In high BRIX pastures, you can actually detect a sweet aroma. Okay, not just the livestock, but you can detect it. Wildlife very much so can do this, and you'll see wildlife congregating to high BRIX plants. We see greater resistance to disease and insect infestation, and we actually have a longer, quote, shelf life to fruits and vegetables and even hays and stored forages that were higher BRIX. This is why BRIX is so important. In pastures where our forage BRIX content is 5% or less, the average daily gain on cattle will average in the low ones or less. Okay? Where we can increase BRIX in our forages to between 8 and 12%, average daily gains will now go to 2 to 2.2, 2.3. When we can increase BRIX to 12 to 15%, we can now go 2.5, 6, 7, and 8. When we're above 15%, average daily gains now are in the high 2s to low 3s. And basic rule of thumb through our regression equation analysis is that for every 1% increase in BRIX in our forages, that'll add another 1/10 to 3/10 of a pound average daily gain to our cattle. So some important grazing tips, particularly for finishing cattle, is that we need to know our forage dry matter availability and allow 3 to 3.5% available to the cattle on a daily basis. For finishing cattle, we don't want to allow them to take any more than 30% of the available dry matter, and we want to move them forward rapidly and not allow too many bites of the same plant. We want to know the BRIX content of our forages so that we turn them in at peak BRIX. And here's another little helpful hint. BRIX is always the highest in the early afternoon. early to mid-afternoon. So wait until then, particularly if you're finishing cattle, to turn them into a new paddock. And as we saw earlier, that even the stage of forage maturity is critical to that sugar-protein ratio. So some conclusions taken both from our studies and from Teague and co-workers. We found that when you use adaptive high stock density grazing, with flexible, you're allowed to have flexible stocking and densities, and that allows you to match your forage availability to the animal numbers. It allows you to more properly graze the whole farm or ranch. You can implement moderate grazing during the growing season, moving them forward rapidly through short graze periods but allowing longer recovery. And therefore you can graze again before the forages get too mature, and you can adaptively adjust to the prevailing conditions. This is where most grazers that try to implement high stock density grazing principles go wrong. They fail to adapt to prevailing conditions. Right here in Mississippi right now, we're extremely wet. Our soils are saturated. So we're having to spread our cattle out more, lower stock densities. Otherwise, we'll puck our ground up tremendously. But as it dries out and we get rapid forage growth due to our warming temperatures and warming nights, then we can start really increasing those stock densities and moving cattle forward at high stock density very rapidly. Okay? So again, the key is being able to adjust to your prevailing conditions and not view this as a rigid system. Other benefits, we've done some work with Audubon, and we've been able to adapt grazing principles that are very bird friendly, where we can provide brooding and nesting and ground cover and feeding habitat for ground nesting birds. These are just some examples of purposefully left areas in our pastures to accommodate ground nesting birds, and these are things that we can do and rotate through our pastures on an annual basis. The birds don't have to have the same nesting and brooding areas on your acreage every year. They'll find it. You can move that around and they'll find it every year. In some work done in Wisconsin, you can see that through proper grazing practices, we've been able to significantly increase bird populations. We've done some work with Trout Unlimited, and you can see that these are examples of improper grazing of stream side areas. But with proper grazing of stream side areas, we found that you can significantly improve these trout fisheries. And the pictures that you see here on the left and right, this is the same stream. The picture on the left and the picture on the right were taken from the same bridge with the road going across, splitting these areas. The picture on the left is where livestock were used for stream side restoration. The picture on the right is where there's been no livestock impact, and it's becoming heavily choked with weeds, brush, alders, willows, and all kinds of things that are slowly choking the stream. They're narrowing the stream up, and they're significantly reducing trout habitat. Another thing that we're working with through the PASTURE project is the cap and trade program and carbon offsets, and being able to provide farmers and ranchers with actual residual income or secondary income on a per acre basis through documented carbon capture. And we've calculated that as this progresses, it could be worth 40 to 60 or even more dollars per acre in terms of residual income. And that's income that they were not deriving before. And then finally, I just want to present some new market opportunities that can emerge from applying our adaptive grazing principles, and this is in the grass-fed sector. We've done a lot of research, and we've also looked at other research. We looked at the 2012 Mintel Red Meat Report, and we found that grass-fed beef is now accounting for up to 6% of all beef sales in major metro areas in the U.S. The top 15 grass-fed branded programs in the U.S. are now harvesting more than 2,000 head weekly and more than 104,000 head annually. They're marketing to more than 5,000 retail outlets. We also are now seeing a lot of long-established natural brands that are now heavily involved in the grass-fed sector, including brands like Nolan Ryan, Maverick Ranch, Creekstone, Strauss brand, Meyer Natural Angus, and so forth. They're now all actively marketing grass-fed lines of beef in addition to their all-natural lines of grain-fed beef. And we're also seeing major investment firms and lenders becoming heavily involved in the grass-fed sector. In 2013, more than $2 billion worth of grass-fed beef was marketed in the U.S., this being a combination of both domestically produced and imported. We now have more than 3,000 beef cattle producers involved nationwide. Over the last 10 years, the grass-fed sector has been growing at an annual rate of 25 to 30%, and it's penetrated all major market sectors. So much so that the USDA AMS has now split off a separate grass-fed beef market report. And as you know, they would not have done this if the numbers did not support this. Currently, the report is voluntary, it is confidential, and they're reporting on national averages only. This is where we see the future of the beef industry headed. We see it divided into 5 major segments. We're still going to have the commodity grain-fed sector, but we're continuing to see a growth in the all-natural and organic grain-fed sectors. And then we're seeing the grass-fed sector divided into 2 categories. One called the lean grass-fed market that's targeting the hamburger market out there, and the other being the high-quality grass-fed. That's grass-fed beef that is choicing up and going to restaurants and food service and places like that. We're also seeing a significant growth in a new emerging market that we're calling the specialty grain-fed market, and this is non-GMO grain-fed cattle. I get a number of calls every week from distributors, restaurants, retailers, and so forth seeking out non-GMO grain-fed beef. So this is a sector that is going to continue to grow. Within 5 to 10 years, we're anticipating that the grass-fed sector will comprise 30+% of the total beef market share in the U.S. And this is substantiated by data that has been compiled by both Bill Helming, who is the former NCBA chief economist and founder of CattleFacts, and Don Close of Rabobank. And they're both obviously, very entrenched commodity beef industry guys, but both of these individuals who are, very strategic in the economic analysis of the beef industry, both of these guys are predicting this type of growth in the grass-fed sector. And so this is what we're looking for, animals that are grass-fed being as well finished as those animals that are coming out of the feedlot. And we are doing that on a routine basis now in the grass-fed sector. And this is an example of grass-fed beef that is being produced today when they are finished to an optimum degree of finish. This will be upper 2/3 choice grass-fed beef, and this is USDA prime grass-fed beef. And that's what we're after. The same as what we're getting out of the grain-fed beef. We're after a high-quality eating experience, and we want to build for our future generations. So that's my presentation. I'd be very happy to address any questions that anybody might have.
Hi, this is Jen from Pasture Project. We're having a little bit of an audio problem with Warren, and I just wanted to see if I can get everybody's audio going. Warren, can you join now? Warren? Well, apologies. We are having a little bit of an audio issue, but let's move forward with questions if people have any.
Well, I'll ask a question of our participants. How many that are participating today have implemented any of these practices in any form or fashion? Or are you working with any producers that are doing this?
I'm a producer. I just fenced an area to do some research with AHSD in the coming years.
Oh, great, great. Are you, what is your goal in terms of stock density and all that? What are your thoughts in terms of how you want to initiate and implement this?
Well, I have in that area where I'm rotationally grazing, I have about 10-acre paddocks, and I'm running about 75,000 pounds an acre on those. So my density isn't very high, but the area that I fence just to research is less than an acre. So I think when I do graze it, and I assume we'll probably do that when it gets mature in August or something like that, I haven't measured it yet, but if it's a fourth of an acre, I'll be like 300,000 pounds in an acre density. So that's where I'm starting out anyway.
Good. Well, I guess two things that I would, from having done this quite a bit. First of all, yeah, definitely wait till your forages are beyond mid-maturity before you turn the cattle in, because you want to have enough stand height and density to support the high stock density grazing impact. And then secondly, utilize close observation and move them off of there, before they have been able to take more than 50% of your available forage dry matter.
Okay. That was a question I was coming to. If I assume I'm going to be there pretty much that day, watching this situation at that density.
Yeah, right. At that density, yes, and particularly when you're first starting. Okay, it is important to plan it so that you can be there and observe for two reasons. One is for your benefit, okay, because you want to be able to see what the cattle are doing, observe their behavior, observe how they're grazing, what they're grazing, and obviously make sure they don't take too much, okay? But then secondly, for the cattle's benefit and the plant benefit as well, for the same reasons, okay? What you'll find is that by being there and observing, the things that you learn, and I can tell you from personal experience, are astounding. And even, I've been doing this for a lot of years now on a personal basis, and I can tell you that I still the learning curve is still there, okay? And it's fascinating because what you observe, what you see, what you learn just continues day after day after day. And the other reason for being there is to prevent yourself from making a mistake, you know, and leaving them on too long and basically creating a bare, plowed up pasture.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. If I progress to one of my, I've kind of got in mind that if I progress, I might go to one of these 10-acre paddocks, my forest paddock, I guess I would go to. I'll have to fence that into smaller sections to be effective with this program, won't I?
Well, all you have to do, I use a ton. I don't have a lot of permanent interior fencing. I have some strategically placed permanent interior fencing, okay, or cross fencing. Mostly what I use to subdivide those much bigger cross fence pastures is single strand electrified polywire with some kind of tread in post. I like to use pigtails. You know, people use different types of things. You can use the fiberglass post and loop them around or whatever. But the pigtails are very quick and easy and very durable. That's why I use them. But you know, it's very quick and easy. What I do is for every 1,000 acres, okay, and I'm giving you this scale so that you understand how really easy this is to implement, okay. For every 1,000 acres, you can basically spend about 6 to 8 hours, 1 day a week, fencing in your paddocks using polywire for movement the rest of the week, okay? And then the rest of the week, all you have to do is either go in and take down that strand between the paddocks or open a gap gate. And the cattle will readily flow from the one that they just grazed into the next one. So really, the rest of the week, all it entails is just allowing the cattle to move from one to the next. And if you're operating at a smaller scale, you know, then in a couple of hours a week, you can string enough strands of polywire, you know, to graze them all week long. And turning them into the next paddock each day requires 5 minutes. But what you'll find is that you'll stand out there an hour or more just because you love observing what you're seeing. And that becomes the power of this whole deal, is the observation. And I'll just give you a little personal experience here from my earlier years when I grazed much more conventionally. I spent all my time, you know, in the summer cutting, raking, baling, and putting up hay, and then all winter feeding the darn stuff back out. And I didn't spend much time at all actually observing the cattle or observing my forages or anything else, because I was always concerned about, I got to get the hay up or I got to get the hay out, and I got to go feed the next group and the next group and so forth. But now that time is spent observing, and I love it because I have learned since I started doing this so much more, and realized that things that were there in front of me all along in the prior years, I never even paid any attention to. So you'll start loving your life with your cattle more, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
It's a lot more fun.
I can understand that. If I'm doing that right, then with the polywire, I won't have to worry about back grazing.
Yeah, here's what I do, and that's a very, very good question. Okay, and it's actually one of the first questions most people ask is, what about the back grazing? First of all, yes, if you're doing it right and you have appropriate stock densities, they're not interested in back grazing that week. Okay, so what I do is I build paddocks for the week and then rotate them that week, and I don't put up a back fence for that week. okay? I just move them forward and I keep taking up the strands as they move forward. Then I move them on to the very next section for the next week, and that starting point becomes my back fence for the next week, okay? And so for a 5 to 7 day period, back grazing is not an issue. The ground's still soiled, it's still trampled, you have very little regrowth yet that they're interested in, and they're always going to move forward. So back grazing becomes a very, very simple thing to handle.
I've got another question with regards to this. My paddocks there in the area I'm talking about right now are fescue red clover.
Yes, sir.
And I've kept that simple because I always felt like cattle always had preferences with regard to what they graze. But in the situation you're talking about, you're actually, the cattle won't have time to do preferable grazing, or will they still have preferences and leave some things, or will we have pretty good uniformity?
This is where your observation will be very important, and what you'll find is that you're totally changing their grazing behavior and their mindset, okay? When they're spread out, then they don't have anybody close to them, you know, and they're going to selectively graze because there's no competition. They don't feel any competitive pressure, all right? And so they just feel like they can graze whatever the heck they want to graze it, whenever they want to graze it, and that's exactly what they do. However, when you have higher stock densities and they see an animal right beside them on the left-hand side, right beside them on the right-hand side, there's animals in front, there's animals in the back, you know what they do? And again, we've observed this and filmed this, and the cattle just put their heads down and become a mowing machine. There is no, I mean, they graze whatever's in front of them at that point in time, because their mindset is, if I don't get it, my neighbor right next to me on either side is going to get it, so I better take that bite before they take that bite. So you basically eliminate that selectivity.
And you pretty much said that would start happening at about 250,000, or would it be higher? Would you say higher than that?
Actually, I've observed it happening when we get to about 125,000 and greater.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Very good questions, though. Thank you. Anybody else?
Alan, will your slide presentation be available somewhere, or is it available somewhere?
Yes, it'll be available on the Wallace Center Pasture Project website.
Okay.
Right, and also we will be loading a link to a film, a short 12-minute documentary that was produced by Carbon Nation, Peter Bick and Carbon Nation, and it is called Soil Carbon Cowboys. But we'll be putting that link up, and that will give you some visual on people that are actually doing this and implementing these grazing methodologies. So you'll be able to see, you can watch that short 12-minute feature and be able to see what they're doing and the stock densities that they're utilizing, how they're setting up their paddocks. all of those types of things.
Okay, good. I have another question on organic matter, and I probably should, if I'm really going to know what's going on, measure that organic matter right now, and then measure it when next spring again, about this same time.
Yeah, I would take your soil samples in the spring when your moisture content is good, and I would do that annually so that you can track the progress. What you need, though, is you need to make sure that you're getting the appropriate analysis. Unfortunately, with a lot of our typical soil analysis at a lot of land grants right now, they're inadequate. Okay, so you want to make sure you get your major and minor elements, but you also get your both your water pH and your buffer pH for your soil. Okay, so you should get 2 different pH measurements. You want to get soil organic matter. You want a CEC, or cation exchange capacity, and you want to get base, BASE, base saturation measures. I personally like to use A and L laboratories. A is in Allen, L is in Larry, but you can go to ALL lab or labs, I can't remember whether it's lab or labsplural.com, and they do an excellent job of doing a complete soil fertility analysis and of giving you a printout that's easily interpreted. Okay, but the key is you want to use the same lab every year. Okay.
Okay.
But make sure you get all of those measures that I just listed.
Okay. Water pH, buffer pH, soil organic matter,
CEC,
mace saturation,
and base, BASE, base saturation, right?
okay.
And of course, your major and minor element. Yeah,
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, anything else?
Well, I apologize that we haven't been able to get Warren King's audio going, and I hope there's nobody else frantically trying to communicate. I've unmuted everyone I can, but I think this is as good as it's going to get for today's webinar.
And I don't see anything else in the chat box. Do you have anything?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, then again, I appreciate everybody's attendance this morning, and you're always welcome to email or call me if you have any questions that you think of after this. And as always, you're welcome to go on our Pasture Project website. We're constantly uploading new information there. This presentation will be available there. We'll put the link up for the Soil Carbon Cowboy documentary as well for your viewing. And anything else you need, don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan.
You bet.